after the Hungarian and Polish revolts, that the Stalinist practice of mass repression had severely damaged the system, and that radical measures were necessary to restore it. It was then that they decided to transform the Stalinist system into a more attractive form of communist democracy. It was not in 1985, but in 1958, that the communist leaders accepted that their economic system was ineffective and lagging behind the West in productivity. It was then that they decided that it would have to be revived through the introduction of market incentives. It was then that the communist leaders realized that communism could not be spread abroad against a background of fear and mass repression, and that world communist victory could only be achieved by transforming the Soviet and other communist regimes into a form more attractive to the West. It was during 1958 to 1960 that the communist leaders envisaged the convergence of restructured and transformed capitalist systems, leading ultimately to one system of world government. World government. Taking account of the military strength of NATO, the communist leaders decided to build up their military strength as a guarantee of the success of their program of domestic reform and as a pressure weapon for disarmament negotiations with the West and the execution of their strategy of convergence. Accepting the necessity for stability in the political leadership of the USSR for the execution of the long-range strategy, the Soviet leaders rejected Stalin's practice of eliminating his rivals and reverted to Lenin's style of leadership. They solved the problem through the selection by the Central Committee of Nikita Khrushchev's successor in advance of Khrushchev's own retirement. Leonid Brezhnev had already been chosen in this way in July of 1960 when he was made president and was given a special briefing by the chairman of the KGB in preparation for the new responsibilities he would be assuming when Khrushchev stepped down. A common commitment to the long-range strategy itself became a factor in the prevention of further power struggles. Western experts failed to understand this because Khrushchev's retirement was deliberately misrepresented by the Soviet leaders to the West as his dismissal. In this and in other ways, the origin of the long-range deception strategy of Perestroika was successfully concealed. Under the guidance of the party apparatus, special research studies were initiated and carried out from September 1957 onwards by the Soviet Academy of Sciences in preparation for the strategy. The party apparatus and its think tanks, the Higher Party School, and the Academy of Social Sciences employed the results of this research in seeking scientific and theoretical solutions to the primary domestic problems associated with the strategy. It was these think tanks which developed the scenarios for Soviet reforms and trained Soviet and Bloc Party leaders such as Dubček in the spirit and demands of the strategy. The KGB Institute and its research department conducted a number of special studies for the Central Committee. Among them were studies on new methods of neutralizing political opposition in the Soviet Union and disclosure of state secrets in the interest of strategy, which has an obvious connection with the present openness, or glasnost, one feature of which is the disclosure of quantities of accurate information together with quantities of disinformation. Special studies of the economies and international relations of the leading capitalist countries were conducted by the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. The Institute paid close attention to the European Common Market and to clashes of economic interest between the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. The appointment of the director of this institute as a chief economic advisor to Gorbachev can be explained by the contribution made by the Institute to the strategy of perestroika. A special research organ, the Institute for the Study of the USA and Canada, was set up in 1960 in Moscow to meet the demands of the strategy. For almost the whole period of the strategy, the Institute, led by academician Georgiy Arbatov, has studied in depth every major political, social, cultural, and racial problem in the United States. The Institute keeps a close watch on the workings of the executive, Congress, the press, political parties, and the more important religious organizations. Arbatov and his subordinates have established close relations with the American elite, cultivating many leading politicians, scientists, religious leaders, experts in Soviet affairs, journalists, and cultural figures through meetings in Washington and invitations to visit the Soviet Union. Soviet-American student exchanges have been used to study the workings of American institutions and to train Soviet experts in areas which have a bearing on the execution of the strategy. You may remember that William Jefferson Clinton was one of those chosen for the Soviet-American student exchange program. For instance, Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's key advisor on international policy and the promotion of perestroika in the American media, studied the media at Columbia University on an exchange program. The Soviet embassy in Washington has played a special role in studying the inner workings of American policy formulation and providing advice to Soviet strategists. A significant novelty was introduced into the work of the Soviet ambassador to the United States. In the interests of the strategy, Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin was made chief KGB resident in Washington in order that the diplomatic work of the embassy could be fully coordinated with the exploitation of the assets of the KGB residentura, especially its important agents of influence among politicians, businessmen, scientists, and, of course, Western journalists. Anatoly Golitsyn prepared a special memorandum on Anatoly Dobrynin for the CIA, which confirmed Dobrynin's use of KGB agents along strategic lines. The late Mr. James Angleton concluded that the memorandum should be published in declassified form in order to neutralize Dobrynin's political influence in Washington and have him expelled for interference in the internal affairs of the United States. The findings of the memorandum were, however, disregarded after the Watergate hearings, which destabilized the American intelligence and counterintelligence services. In accordance with a party decision, the KGB was assigned a key role in the execution of the strategy. In 1959, the KGB, under Alexander Shelepin, was instructed to employ its intelligence and security assets, not for mass repression, but in the interests of strategy against the main enemy. Its main task became the neutralization and dissolution of genuine political opposition by nationalists and anti-Soviet intellectuals. Now, let me read that again to you. Its main task became the neutralization and dissolution of genuine political opposition by nationalists and anti-Soviet intellectuals. The KGB was ordered to create controlled political opposition and to introduce it to Western intelligence services along the lines of Dzerzhinsky's trust. As this Mr. Golitsyn revealed in the early 1960s, the KGB began the creation of a controlled dissident movement with a skillful, controlled dispute between liberal writers like Alexander Tvardovsky, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, and Nikolai Voznesensky, and conservatives like Vsevolod Kochetov. The KGB recruited and developed important agents of influence allied with the dissidents among leading Soviet scientists like Andrei Sakharov and Peter Kapitsa. It was no accident that modern dissident prisoners at this time were allowed by the KGB to become visible and famous and to be monitored by human rights groups in the West, unlike the totally isolated and unheard of inmates of Stalin's prisons who simply perished without trace. It is important to note that famous dissidents achieved a high public profile before the advent of glasnost, or openness. The task of agents of influence, like the late Andrei Sakharov, is not a propaganda one. It is to act as assistants in the execution of the strategy of Soviet reform and convergence with the West. The KGB further recruited a number of theater and movie directors, writers and journalists, and unofficially encouraged them to experiment with formerly taboo and controversial subjects like repression, prison life, rehabilitation, and questions of conscience and religion. The object of these experiments was to prepare these chosen individuals for the role of initiators and catalysts in the forthcoming controlled liberalization of the Soviet regime. The KGB reoriented its old agents among Soviet religious leaders, the KGB's Gapons, and used their influence to help convergence with the Western churches. Convergence with the Western churches. The KGB benefited from the experience of exploiting religious leaders under Stalin in the Second World War, and in the 1960s they employed that experience on a larger scale and with greater sophistication. The KGB, the party, the press, and even the courts have been used for the calculated public exposure of dissidents and their activities in the West as examples for the education and re-education of Western anti-Soviet intellectuals. On the initiative of the KGB, an army of Soviet vigilantes 5 million strong, the so-called Druzhiny, was recruited from among the Komsomol activists. Their units were led by retired Chekists. They have been patrolling and policing the streets of all the Soviet cities. Their primary task has been to prepare the Soviet people to behave during the forthcoming liberalization of Perestroika. Soviet psychiatry and the incarceration of active anti-communists in psychiatric hospitals have been used to educate and intimidate the population into further submission to the regime by demonstrating that only the mentally abnormal protest against it. The party has also used détente with the West as a weapon against Soviet anti-communists, arguing that anti-communism in the Soviet Union is hopeless because even the West accepts the Soviet system. The communist press obtained maximum mileage from the American failure to help the Czechoslovaks when their party-controlled democratization, in fact, ran out of control in 1968. This had a sobering effect on genuine anti-communists in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. Furthermore, for the purpose of dissolving genuine opposition, the KGB facilitated the selective immigration of individuals who were hostile to the system or who wished to join relatives abroad. All these KGB and party methods, together with the natural aging and death of Stalin's former victims, resulted in the disappearance of active anti-communists and the general acceptance of the regime by the Soviet population. By the 1980s, there were no social democrats or politically active nationalists left alive in the Soviet Union. By then, the KGB and the party apparatus had succeeded in creating conditions in which only they could form strong grassroots organizations, just as I've been telling you for years. And they're doing it here in the United States today. The KGB and the party conducted their preparations for perestroika in close cooperation with the parties and security services of the other communist countries. The successful preparation for perestroika by the KGB and the ministries of the interior of the Georgian and other national republics of the USSR explains the promotion of their heads, Alexander Shalepin, Yuri Andropov, Gaider Aliyev, Eduard Shevardnadze, Viktor Shebrikov, and Andrei Vlasov to the Politburo and other key strategic positions. Since 1959, the communist bloc parties and governments have been involved in political, practical experiments and rehearsals for separate elements of perestroika in different countries in preparation for its introduction overall. The most important of these experiments and rehearsals were an attempt at liberalization in the early 1960s under Khrushchev, publication of an article about market economics by Professor Yevsey Lieberman and experiments with firms and trusts in 1962, Alexei Kosygин's economic reforms in 1965, alleged Romanian independence from the early 1960s onwards, the Cultural Revolution in China, in fact, a campaign of ideological and political re-education and a preparation of the inexperienced and inept Chinese party bureaucracy for détente with the capitalist West, democratization in Czechoslovakia in 1968, legislation by the Polish Communist Party of Solidarity in 1980, and the introduction of capitalist incentives in China and Hungary during the 1970s and the 1980s. The Soviet strategists studied the performance, outcome, lessons, and mistakes of these experiments and rehearsals. No doubt, they drew proper practical conclusions from the excesses of the Cultural Revolution in China and the loss of control over the experiments with democratization in Czechoslovakia and solidarity in Poland. They probably also drew conclusions from the painful experiences of Yugoslavia. The experience gained was of enormous benefit for influencing the introduction of perestroika in all its elements in their totality in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, known to most of you as the Soviet Union. The development and execution of the strategy over a 30-year period has strengthened Soviet power militarily, politically, and with Western help, economically. Anatoly Golitsyn strongly disagreed with Brzezinski's assessment that the USSR is collapsing. The execution of the strategy has broadened the political base of the Communist Party in the Russian and the other national republics. Careful preparation has created the conditions for overall perestroika and the transition of the regime in the most powerful and experienced of the socialist countries to a phase of communist democracy. Naturally, the Soviet leaders seek to avoid alerting the West to what is happening by describing the process in these terms. From the time the strategy was adopted, the party leadership made it clear to its technocrats, bureaucrats, military, and intellectuals that the requirements of the strategy are paramount for their activities and the assessment of their performance. Because of these demands and party discipline, there can be no genuine opposition among conservatives in the party, the military, or the technocracy. Bold experiments and successful execution of the strategy in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Communist China have given party leaders, KGB officials, generals, technocrats, and leading intellectuals a political maturity and sophistication which they have revealed in Perestroika. Because of their longer historical experience, their greater political, economic, and military potential, and their thorough preparation, the communist strategists and the ruling elite are confident that they can guide and lead their people without the loss of control which occurred in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and in Poland in 1981. However, in the event of control nonetheless being endangered in given contexts, the situation will be retrieved in the usual manner, simply by means of military repression. The new method sees perestroika not as a surprising and spontaneous change, but as the logical result of 30 years of preparation and as the next and final phase of the strategy. It sees in a broader context than Soviet openness has revealed. It sees it not only as a renewal of Soviet society, but as a global strategic design for restructuring the entire capitalist world. The following strategic objectives of perestroika may be distinguished. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, Anatoly Golitsyn disclosed this plan as early as 1961, December to be exact. For the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A. Restructuring and revitalization of the Soviet socialist economy through the incorporation of some elements of the market economy. B. Restructuring of the Stalinist regime into a form of communist democracy with an appearance of political pluralism, or democratization, I should say, or democratism. C. Reconstructing a repressive regime with a brutal face into an attractive socialist model with a human facade and a seeming similarity to the Swedish social democratic system. For Eastern Europe, economic and political restructuring of the existing regimes into pseudo-social democratic models while preserving specific national historical features such as the strong Catholic socialist tradition in Poland and the pre-war democratic tradition in Czechoslovakia. For Western Europe, A. Bringing about a new political alliance between the pseudo-social democratic regimes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the Euro-communist parties and genuine social democratic parties in Western Europe. B. Restructuring political and military blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the creation of a single Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, incorporating a reunited neutral Germany. Are you listening? For the main United States alliances, A. Splitting the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. B. Dissolution of NATO and the United States-Japan Security Pact, and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Western Europe and Japan. For Third World countries, the introduction and promotion of a new Soviet model with a mixed economy and a human face in Latin America, Africa, and Asia through a joint campaign by the pseudo-social democrat regimes of the old Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the genuine social democrats of Western Europe led by the Socialist Internationale. For the United States, A. To neutralize the influence of the anti-communist political right in the American political parties and to create favorable conditions for a victory of the radical left in the 1992 United States presidential elections. And if you've been paying attention, ladies and gentlemen, they certainly accomplished that. B. To restructure the American military, political, economic, and social status quo to accommodate greater convergence between the Soviet and American systems and the eventual creation of a single world government. The paramount global objective of the strategy of perestroika is to weaken and neutralize anti-communist ideology and the influence of anti-communists in political life in the United States, Western Europe, and elsewhere, presenting them as anachronistic survivors of the Cold War, reactionaries and obstacles to restructuring and peace. Anyone who warns about Moscow's true objectives is automatically branded a Cold Warrior, even by people who have doubts about Moscow's motives. The new method penetrates the facade, tears the verbal mask off perestroika, and reveals its true meaning, which Gorbachev and Glasnost have failed to do. Lenin's teaching and the experience of the new economic policy are keys to understanding the essence of perestroika and the reasons for Gorbachev's downgrading and reunification of elements of ideological orthodoxy like the class struggle and his emphasis on common interests and the benefits of close cooperation. Lenin advised the communists that they must be prepared to resort to all sorts of stratagems, maneuvers, illegal methods, evasions, and subterfuge to achieve their objectives. This advice was given on the eve of his reintroduction of limited capitalism in Russia in his work, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. The new method sees perestroika as an application of Lenin's advice in new conditions. Another speech of Lenin's in the NEP period at the Comintern Congress in July 1921 is again highly relevant to understanding perestroika. Our only strategy at present, wrote Lenin, is to become stronger and therefore wiser, more reasonable, more opportunistic. The more opportunistic, the sooner will you again assemble the masses around you. When we have won over the masses by our reasonable approach, we shall then apply offensive tactics in the strictest sense of the word. It is obvious that Gorbachev's opportunistic speeches and his presentation of perestroika to the West are very clever applications of Lenin's thinking. Gorbachev's reasonableness and moderation are aimed at assembling and winning over the masses throughout the world, and yet another of Lenin's speeches is relevant here. Instructing the Soviet delegation to the Genoa Conference in 1921, he advised them to use moderate language in negotiations in order not to frighten the capitalists and particularly to avoid reference to the class struggle, the violence, and the terrorist aspects of communist doctrine. Gorbachev's speech to the United Nations and Shevardnadze's pronouncements about a downgrading of the class struggle are classic applications of Lenin's thinking. The new method views the ostensible arguments about the class struggle in the Soviet Union as no more than a calculated device to win over Western policymakers and influence public opinion in favor of Gorbachev's policies. The new method also sees a close parallel between Western expectations arising out of the new economic policy and those arising. I've got to stop and take a drink of water. My tongue is getting tied to my cheek again. The new method also sees a close parallel between Western expectations arising out of the new economic policy and those arising out of perestroika. In view of this parallel, the outcome of the NEP can be instructive now. The new economic policy was presented by the Soviets and accepted by the West as a retreat from communist ideology and a decline in the power of the Soviet regime. In fact, the NEP revived the Soviet economy, stabilized Soviet power, and facilitated the creation of the Soviet Federation. Because of the NEP, the Soviets were able to broaden their ideological and political assault on the capitalist world. To sum up, the essence of perestroika is the creative application of Lenin's thinking and the experience gained through the NEP to the final battle with the capitalist world. It is a step backwards to take 2 steps forward. Perestroika is a Leninist strategy involving the calculated renunciation of ideological orthodoxy in order to win over the masses and to achieve strategic objectives in Europe, the United States, and the Third World. The experience of the new economic policy teaches us that contemporary Soviet pragmatism and opportunism are not lasting because they are tactical. Gorbachev is a committed Leninist who is carrying out the strategy of communist renewal as a means towards the ultimate conquest of the Western democracies. And if you don't believe it, ladies and gentlemen, I challenge you to obtain Mr. Gorbachev's book entitled Perestroika and read it very carefully. President Reagan responded in 2 ways to the Soviet threat. At first, he revived the American economy and restored American military strength. He described the Soviet Union quite correctly as the evil empire. Although unaware of the long-range strategy, he hurt the Soviets with his rhetoric, which threatened their strategic objectives. For his accomplishments in this period, history will treat Mr. Reagan kindly. But subsequently, President Reagan became involved in a new détente with Gorbachev and went over to support for perestroika without realizing its essence and its dangers for the West. In the light of this analysis, President Reagan's embrace of Gorbachev and his proclaimed closeness to the Soviets was a grave strategic blunder, which will have far-reaching and dangerous consequences for the security of America and her allies. It has imparted a misguided direction to the foreign policies of the United States, the European allies, and Japan. It has, in fact, invited the Soviets to begin their strategy of restructuring in Europe and especially in Germany. It has given them the opportunity to begin the execution of their strategy in the United States and to engage the American and West European elite, in particular the European Social Democrats, in close cooperation over restructuring. It has generated enormous euphoria in the West and an eager willingness to provide the Soviet Union with credits and technology. West European and Japanese bankers are in frenzied competition with each other to finance restructuring. West European bankers, with encouragement from Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the West German foreign minister, are already thinking of a new Marshall Plan to finance the failing economies of Eastern Europe. New opportunities have been opened up for the Soviets to undermine and neutralize rational and healthy anti-communism and the influence of the right in the political life of the Western democracies. President Reagan's closeness to the Soviets has also sent a misleading signal to their adversaries. It allows the Soviet leaders and their Communist Party to strengthen their hold over the Soviet people and to involve them in practical perestroika in the Soviet Union. Furthermore, it allows them to achieve their main strategic objective of winning over the masses in both the communist and the capitalist worlds. President Reagan's embrace of Gorbachev and perestroika has made it difficult for the new administration to develop its own policies towards the Soviets by stoking up public expectations and popular pressure for continuing rapprochement with the Soviets. The new method detects an active Soviet offensive to reach the American elite and to engage it in close cooperation and restructuring in the United States. This operation is evident inter alia from the following developments. 1. The meeting between Gorbachev, his chief American experts, Dobrynin, Ambassador Dobrynin, Yakovlev, Arbatov, Posner and others, and selected members of the American elite and selected members of the American elite present at the Soviet embassy during Gorbachev's first visit to Washington. Now, I'm sure that you've all seen Vladimir Posner on television. He is a leading member of a new jet set of Russian officials who commute between Moscow and the United States. He was born in France. He speaks perfect American English, having grown up in New York. He returned with his parents to the Soviet Union in 1952 and later became a commentator on Soviet television. He acquired a reputation as a strong supporter of Perestroika in the early Gorbachev period. He reappeared in the United States ahead of the August coup and became a co-host of the Posner-Donahue show. Not many of you in the audience know that Phil Donahue has been a communist for most of his life. On the Posner-Donahue show, on which he has offered his comments and interpretations on perestroika, developments in Russia, socialism, capitalism, and life. According to his own remarks on United States television, he communicates regularly between Russia and the United States. Posner, in short, is a good example